Dear Jonathan, it was a pleasure to meet you at the Thunder Bay Conference. I wanted to contribute to your project of elucidating a cosmology that makes room for higher beings in a way that is still consistent with humanity's scientific knowledge. Is there a way to understand higher beings in a way that is anything other than metaphorical? Are there really egregores, demons, or angels? Even if we find that yes, higher beings do exist, that is, there are large-scale patterns that exhibit autonomy, we're still a long way from supposing that these higher forms have consciousness. However, like you, I believe that it is genuinely possible that some do. I know there's been a lot of discussion going on about whether these higher beings are conscious.
Yeah,
right?
I think they are. I avoid it because I don't think at this point it's necessary to get to that. It's like if you don't think it's conscious, that's fine. We can talk around it for now. We'll get to there later. But I do think that.
But let's slow down for a minute. If anyone other than you is watching this, I can't just burst into the video with conscious angels. I want to take the time to build up the case for such a cosmology. I'm going to send you this letter in two parts. The first part is about metaphysics and ontology, what kind of universe we're living in, what is real, etc. This sets up the second part, which is where the rubber hits the road in looking at the mind-life continuity thesis as a way to understand the possibility for higher beings and their potential for consciousness. The best way into the first part, I think, is to start with patterns. More specifically, taking them as a kind of ontological primitive. Here's Paul Vanderklay talking about how patterns brought you and Jordan Peterson together.
Basically, how Pageau and Peterson found each other and why they interested each other is that both had this assumption that reality is fundamentally patterns.
What's the world? Well, the world's made of objects. It's like, no, it's not. It's made of patterns.
And I'd heard this from both of them before, and I was just trying to get my head around it. What do you mean reality is fundamentally patterns? I had enough materialism still in me that, no, that can't be right, because the matter is foundational and the patterns are derivative. And Pageau simply flips that around and says, okay, well, what if the pattern is foundational and the matter expresses the pattern?
The philosopher Dan Dennett has also delved into the subject of patterns, culminating in a classic paper, Real Patterns. Dennett's primary aim in his paper is to show why talk about mental states in the language of folk psychology is not just sloppy shorthand for a complete neurological description, but that these mental states have their own existence apart from the neurology. Dennett's notion of a pattern is not something that repeats, as might be expected, but rather that in information space, patterns are compressible. Using the concept of a bitmap to suggest a complete informational description of some data, Dennett says, a pattern exists in some data, is real, if there is a description of the data that is more efficient than the bitmap, whether or not anyone can concoct it. Dennett's last proviso about whether or not anyone can concoct the description shows that for Dennett, patterns have a human independent existence. This is what is meant by real. It's a simple but important point because talk of descriptions and information can seem to imply that patterns require a human mind in order to exist. But we didn't appear ex nihilo and begin to impose patterns on the universe, as the postmodernists seem to believe. We evolved to find our way around patterns that were already there. Now, it's one thing to acknowledge that patterns are real. It's another to say that these patterns are doing any more work than being the reference of our folk psychological terminology. One might say, fine, pains and desires are real, but they don't cause anything. All the causal work is still being done at the microphysical level. If such a person's correct, then not only is this a problem for higher beings, it's a problem for us. Sam Harris seems to have bought this line of reasoning and vehemently denies the existence of free will. It wasn't until recently that real patterns were vindicated as not only existing, but of being able to have causal powers of their own. In some sense, this shouldn't be surprising, as it's not clear why there would ever come to be agents in a deterministic universe. However, thanks to a scientist on Michael Levin's team, we now have a full-blooded mathematical description of how this is possible.
Literally now, with the new developments in causal emergence, there is now math to literally analyze a given situation and to determine whether or not the most work is done at the lowest level. And in many cases, it is true. In many cases, that's true. But in other cases, it isn't. And so we no longer. It's amazing to me that we are now living in a kind of a world where we no longer have to have philosophical beliefs about it. You can calculate. There's literally a toolkit. There's a piece of software, and you can calculate how much of the causal work is done at the different levels for a given system.
Michael Levin is talking about the work of Eric Hoel, who now works at Levin's lab. Hoel cut his teeth on the integrated information theory of consciousness working as a postdoc under Giulio Tononi. There they worked out the idea of effective information, which is a measure of causation. Dr. Hoel discovered that there are certain groupings of causal mechanisms at macro scales that actually have more causal power than the microscale mechanisms that make them up. This sounds unlikely because as you abstract away from the micro-level description, you are unavoidably losing information. The counterintuitive result of Dr. Hoel's is because of one simple but very important point. The noise level in the information at microscales is greater than the noise level at the appropriate macro scale. So even though you are losing information by grouping the micromechanisms, you are gaining effective information, the definition of causation, because the loss of noise at the appropriate macro scale overcomes the loss of information you suffer by moving away from the micro scale description.
So when you draw it out like this, you can say, well, at the micro scale, you have some big advantage in terms of size, and then I move up to the macro scale, and I'm losing this advantage. But my lack of noise variable might be increasing as I move up, and this can actually outweigh, the gain of information from this era can outweigh the loss of information in this era.
So in some cases, to put it colloquially, there is more causation happening at the large scale than the small scale. Translating this into the real world, if causation can happen at different ontological levels, then we should expect that agents, beings that act in the world, are a likely candidate for high-level causation.
So, hey, that's great. Maybe you actually mattered to the world, but here's the thing, the question is so what, right? I mean, that's like a very philosophical conclusion. I'm actually not super interested in it.
Well, he may not be interested in that, but I sure am. Patterns can't be completely ontologically primitive, because for there to be a pattern, there must be a realizer of that pattern, something for the pattern to exist in. I think you'd agree with this, because in the ontology you've described, there is something eternal, something larger than everything, something in which patterns inhere. We will always be limited by our intellectual and epistemic abilities to completely apprehend such a reality, but we can speak about it symbolically. This metaphysics is vertical, I think, only because humans stand on the ground with our heads in the air, and it's phenomenologically natural to think in these physical metaphors. However, because it's so natural to us, and as a consequence has such a rich history, we gain a lot by embracing it.
Spirit and potential, or actuality and potential, is actually totally fine to see it that way. Dante completely joins together the Aristotelian categories of actuality and potential, and in the creation narrative, the idea of heaven and earth as these two basic principles.
The general picture I see you painting is Neoplatonic in broad strokes.
Neoplatonism. Think of it as an amalgam of Platonism with two other streams of thought. Stoicism, particularly with its emphasis on the logos. Also Neo-Pythagoreanism, and that in view of its concept of emanation. But what the Pythagoreans did was to conceive of a hierarchy of beings with varying degrees of being and perfection. A hierarchy with all sorts of intermediary beings. In fact, even between, shall we say, the human realm and the divine realm, intermediary beings. This notion of a hierarchy of being becomes in fact the conceptual model that governs the Middle Ages, which found expression in the structure of the church and of society, as well as in philosophy and literature, and so on and so forth, and has carried over into some Christian thinking to this day.
They too had a vertical ontology with two poles, one at the top and one at the bottom, encompassed by and suffused with the One, that eternal everything. Jordan Peterson, in conversation with your brother Mathieu, connected the two poles to Taoism, a philosophy that originated around the time of the Old Testament, give or take 100 years. The two poles of the cosmology have been variously labeled pure order and pure chaos, pure actuality and pure potentiality, or pure form and pure substance. The two poles are at the top and the bottom, and there are very many intermediate layers of being in between.
Plotinus says, oh, wait a sec, Aristotle also has sort of levels of being. And we talked about this. We talked about at the lowest level, right, there's pure potentiality, and at the highest level, there's pure actuality.
It's suggested, I think, that we and everything we know are contained in these liminal layers as patterns in the convergence of these two polar principles. This idea of ontological levels or layers is not so far outside of our experience. While not perfectly isomorphic to the layered ontology of our world, the sciences are roughly divided into layers of scale. Quantum physics deals with the subatomic, chemistry with the atomic and molecular interactions, biology with organisms, psychology with the mind, sociology with large-scale social structures, and cosmology with the entire universe. These layers or levels aren't strict, and effects from one can permeate the other levels, so we must be careful not to stretch the metaphor of layers too far. But there is clearly something right about this hierarchy of organization in the universe. We seem to be able to do science at different scales of reality. Sometimes the patterns and rules at each level are very different. Sometimes they're provocatively similar, like the pattern of waves in water versus quantum waves. I think the Neoplatonists believed that between the two polarities was a gradation. The higher something was in the vertical ontology, the more pattern-like it is. The lower, the more potential-like it is. Although every level except the very bottom and the very top were some mixture of the two. In this vertical ontology, pattern imposes form on the matter. Matter here is understood as something like the potential for the ability to do work. Now that we have had quantum mechanics for 100 years, it seems remarkably prescient that potentiality might lie at the heart of reality. For all the world, quantum reality seems probabilistic and not deterministic. But what are the probabilities, possibilities of or in? If we consider finer and finer distinctions below the quantum level, we eventually arrive at distinction itself. Distinction is information. This implies a structure of the world, some kind of constraints that relate bits or distinctions to one another among some finite number of dimensions, but probably large number. The physicist John Archibald Wheeler was early to this party and gave us the slogan, "It from bit." It from bit symbolizes the idea that every item of the physical world has at bottom, at a very deep bottom in most instances, an immaterial source and explanation, that what we call reality arises in the last analysis from the posing of yes-no questions and the registering of equipment-evoked responses. In short, that all things physical are information theoretic in origin, and this is a participatory universe. I believe the Neoplatonists called this structure nous, or mind. Is this what is meant by the mind of God? It seems that the ancients also puzzled over things like the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, and observed quite rightly that there is an isomorphism between our minds and the logic of the world. We moderns might not thereby attribute mind to the universe, as metaphysical idealists do, but if mind just means rule-based relations in information space, then attributing it to the universe strains credulity considerably less. Those who would eschew the idea that we exist in the mind of God might be quite happy to acknowledge that we live within a logical, rule-like structure. The laws of physics are exactly that. Here's a fun metaphor for the nous, the rule-like structure of reality. I'm sure you're familiar with the game Sudoku. You have 9 rows, 9 columns, and within that grid you can define 9 equal 3x3 boxes. The rule, or the structure, is that for every row, column, and box, you must place the numbers 1 through 9 in any order, without missing or repeating any numbers. A particular game of Sudoku begins with a subset of the cells already filled in, and the player's job is to find the unique solution to the whole board that those pre-filled boxes belong to. But what if you had a Sudoku board with all the same rules but no numbers filled in? This is a metaphor for the nous. Structure without any particular content, but many possible solutions. In fact, there are 6 sextillion possible solutions to a Sudoku board. That's 6.7 times 10 to the 21 possibilities in a 9x9 board with a fairly rigid structure. The possibilities in subquantum information space in our entire universe are an inconceivably large number. But what else would you expect from the mind of God? Plotinus' worldview, the famous Neoplatonist, begins with the One, which some Christian writers equate with God. The One is eternal in the sense that it is atemporal. It is omnipresent in that everything that exists within the One. It is omniscient in that its structure, its nous, its mind, is the very structure of reality. In the Platonic tradition, though, there is another sub-entity, a sort of secondary god, the demiurge. The Gnostics cast the demiurge in the villain's role, but for the Platonists, the demiurge was just a necessary step in creation. They personified it as a craftsman. I think that we can equate the demiurge with the realm of pure pattern in your vertical ontology. I find the following thought experiment to be a helpful metaphor for how the realm of pure pattern might cascade and emanate down into the lower levels to structure reality. Imagine a pure field of possibility like our empty Sudoku board, the nous, or mind of God. Suppose that one of the possibilities is a pattern that consumes or subsumes possibility space. The logical conclusion of which is that this possibility becomes a necessity. It's like a pattern that generates an attractor in phase space. Our temporal minds will be tempted to think about this as an unfolding process, but in the atemporal world of nous, there is no distinction between a possibility that subsumes possibilities and the necessity. This pattern that subsumes possibility space, this necessary entity, is the topmost pattern in our vertical ontology. I'm not sure if you agree, but I think this primordial pattern could be profitably equated with the logos. It is the Word of God that is like a seed crystal in a supersaturated liquid. It crystallizes possibility space, delimiting and distinguishing possibilities and impossibilities. Like adding a number to our Sudoku board, the rest of reality must shift and conform to be compatible with its existence. When we add a number, there is a cascading effect, where the possibility space of the cells in the vertical and horizontal planes of the number we just added becomes limited. Where once any number from 1 to 9 was possible, now there is one fewer possible number in the vertical and horizontal dimension. I think this is a decent, although radically simplified, metaphor for the emanations of God. The relations between squares on a Sudoku board are not temporal relations. They are logical relations. To say that God created the world is not, on this view, a description of an event embedded in time, but rather an atemporal or logical, you might say eschatological, description. Be that as it may, this structure seems to have temporal implications for those beings who experience time. We humans observe the universe as moving from simple to complex along the temporal dimension, It gives us the evidence we use to formulate the Big Bang theory, for example. The universe starts with ultimate simplicity, a singularity, to a place with complex life. We seem to be witnessing an aggregation of distinctions in the nous that will eventually lead to the complexity required to become the pattern at the end of the universe. If this pattern is the logos, we are moving toward it, that necessary pattern that subsumes possibility space. This perspective helps to explain some outstanding puzzles in science. In the sciences right now, there is something called the fine-tuning problem. As humans, we have developed mathematical models of the physical universe. Certain properties of the universe, like Einstein's cosmological constant, the strength of the strong force, the properties of carbon, the nuclear efficiency of fusion from hydrogen to helium, and many others besides, have seemingly arbitrary values. But if those values were even a tiny bit different, life would have been impossible. There's no logical contradiction in the idea that the universe may have begun and ended in an instant, or that the energy released from the supposed Big Bang would have just spread chaotically and fizzled out without ever generating higher-level organizations. The fact that it didn't do these things, and that we instead live in a universe with a large hierarchy of organization, is a puzzle. Dr. James Tour, a professor of chemistry at Rice University, has pointed out that even given these constants and relations that characterize our physical world, the chemical reactions necessary for life to have begun on Earth are so unlikely that their combined occurrence is nothing short of miraculous. Some of the conditions for the necessary chemical interactions for life are so short-lived that it is almost unthinkable that they occurred at exactly the right time at which the catalysts appear. What can account for the fact that we find ourselves in a universe that is statistically all but impossible? It's true that we could posit a magical sky daddy to poof these things into existence. I personally think that a more sophisticated understanding of God would be that the existence of this pattern, the logos, that subsumes possibilities, that gobbles up phase space as an ultimate attractor, would entail certain unlikely events, from our perspective, that needed to occur in order for it to exist. In the empty Sudoku world, one cell has 9 possibilities, but once a certain number of other cells have been reified into specific numbers, that cell may be limited to a single possibility. We might ask ourselves why that number and not some other. After all, the chances were 1 in 9. But given the constraints of the board, it had to be that way, no matter how seemingly unlikely it was at the outset. To put it another way, the aspect of God that the Platonists called the demiurge, that I'm tentatively suggesting might be the logos, entails, logically and physically, a world that is consistent with the existence of the logos. We experience this as unlikely events unfolding in time, but from an atemporal perspective, it is just a cascading of constraints down through reality, down through our vertical ontology as emanations or implication that, from our human perspective, seem to be working backwards through time. As temporal beings, we look at the world and marvel at the unlikelihood of certain events. But these miracles may be necessary for reality to unfold as it must. There is a danger when supposing that the universe has some baked-in teleology of becoming a determinist. Not in a reductionist way where the movements of particles decide the whole future, but in a fatalistic way where the telos pulls us reliably toward an endpoint despite ourselves. In Dr. Eric Hull's work, this is not a concern because you can only have one level of reality doing all of the causation in any particular case, lest we have a kind of causal overdeterminism. The notion of effective information that comes out of integrated information theory attempts to capture what Aristotle would have called the efficient cause. In modern times, this is our paradigmatic notion of causation. However, the efficient cause was only one of 4 causes for Aristotle. There's also the material cause, which we can understand to be possibilities in information space, the final cause, the telos of a system, and the formal cause, which we might see as the imposition that pattern has on possibility. The pure pattern pole of our vertical ontology, the provisional logos or demiurge, is both a final cause, what we experience temporally as a movement towards some end state, and a formal cause because that movement is one of the interactions of patterns cascading down through the levels of reality. The formal cause isn't the type of causation that happens when one billiard ball strikes another. That's like efficient causation. Rather, I like to think of it in terms of constraints. Using the billiard example, the formal cause is akin to the constraints of the table. The full set of states that the billiard table can be in has, at its limit, the constraint that all states are on or within the table. The table doesn't take an active role in making the billiard balls move, but it does set limits to how and where they can move. We tend not to notice constraints when we look at systems from a mereological or part-whole perspective, because when you take something apart, that thing's boundary conditions are eliminated and so disappear from view. How do we then understand the final cause, especially in a way that retains the possibility of free will? I believe the solution to this is already implicit in our vertical ontology, but it's worth making it explicit. If we move from the top of our vertical ontology, where pure pattern is situated, down to the bottom, where pure possibility is situated, and if this journey sees a gradation of the ratio of pattern to possibility, we cannot, I don't think, avoid the conclusion that alternate timelines are real. I have no idea what you'll think of this. I imagine you hearing this and saying, yeah, of course, or no, absolutely not, with equal probability. So let me try to move carefully here. To get a sense of how this might work, we can look at the quantum world. For 100 years now, we've known about superpositions of quantum objects. In quantum field theory, it is supposed that every particle is a perturbation in at least one 3D quantum field that fills the entire universe. However, the perturbation is weird. A quantum object will ripple out from its source in a wave pattern where the amplitude of the wave at any given point is directly related to the probability of our finding that energy packet at that particular space-time location, for example. We never see the quantum particle as a wave because any attempt to measure it gives us specific space-time locations of an energy packet, and not the wave itself. However, we can indirectly infer the particle's wave nature from something like the double slit experiment. In the double slit experiment, a single quantum particle, usually either a photon or electron, is emitted at a source and detected at the end of its journey. Along its journey, it is constrained such that it can pass through one or both of two slits in a barrier. If the quantum object was a particle, like a billiard ball, over multiple trials, we'd expect to get two vertical lines roughly behind the two slits as the particle goes through one slit but not the other. This isn't what we see when we run the experiment, though. Over multiple trials, what we actually see is more than two vertical lines. The only way to explain this experimental result is to posit that as the quantum object moves through space as a wave, it goes through both slits and interferes with itself, leaving an interference pattern on the detector. It's not easy to know how exactly to describe a reality in which this strange behavior happens, where the particle is moving as a wave and interacting with other things as a single energy packet. People like Niels Bohr suggested that we should not waste time pontificating on such philosophical matters, and so he recommended a pragmatic approach, which would allow physicists to get on with the business of putting this new physics to work. And work it has. The proliferation of our technology is a testament to that. In addition to the Schrödinger wave equation, which describes the particle as a wave, Bohr's recommendation, which became known as the Copenhagen interpretation, appended a pragmatic rule on the end of all other quantum rules, which says that when you measure a particle, its wave function collapses to a particular state and is no longer in superposition. There's nothing in the math of quantum mechanics that supports this interpretation, but as a pragmatic procedure, it has been fruitful, and it accords well enough with experiment, so long as you don't ask too many questions about what it means to measure a quantum particle. Whatever else you might hear about the Copenhagen interpretation, I don't believe the point was to adopt any particular philosophical view of the nature of quantum particles, but rather to avoid taking a philosophical view of the nature of quantum particles altogether. We are not here to avoid such philosophical speculation, though, so we might ask what exactly is going on here. The first thing to note is that our interaction with quantum particles appears to be probabilistic. That is, we can predict with accuracy in a simple system where a particle, understood now as an energy packet, is likely to show up, and over multiple trials that likelihood appears to be correct. However, in a given single instance, the particle really can show up anywhere in the universe. It just has a higher chance of showing up in some places rather than others. A particle understood as an energy packet only shows up in interaction or entanglement. Before entanglement, however, the particle, again understood as an energy packet, exists in superposition, that is, in multiple states at once. This is more than just a poetic description, because given the double slit experiment, we know that this is so real that the particle in superposition can interfere with itself, leaving telltale traces of this interference in our detectors. If we choose to understand the particle as an energy packet, it's hard to come to any other conclusions that our macroscopic world actually exists atop a set of possible subatomic worlds. The whole idea of superposition is that there are two different possibilities, or more, existing at the same time in the same timeline. In measurement, we commit ourselves to one of these possibilities, but prior to measurement, we must say that our macroscopic world existed simultaneously atop at least two microscopic worlds. Returning to our metaphor of the Sudoku world, entanglement can be imagined as the interaction between two or more numbers influencing the same cell. Entanglement limits the possibilities for what numbers can appear in the affected cell, at the extreme down to one particular number. However, as we know, the limitations for any given cell get more rigid the more numbers we add to the board, or in the metaphor, the more entanglement there is in the system. With an empty Sudoku board, there are 6.7 times 10 to the 21 possible games. As we add numbers to the board, as we add entanglement, the number of possible games becomes dramatically and quickly reduced. Because reality has many more degrees of freedom than our Sudoku world, a single instance of entanglement between two particles does very little to constrain the degrees of freedom in our macroscopic world. Until such time as the state of a particle is constrained to its limit, like in carefully controlled quantum physics experiments, each possible world compatible with the existing constraints are still live possibilities, and I would posit just as real as the world we are experiencing now. The idea that these other possible worlds are just as real as ours comes from a simple modification of the Copenhagen interpretation. Simply remove the ad hoc rule about collapsing the wave function on measurement. In this sense, quantum physics becomes simpler because it has fewer rules, and especially fewer ad hoc rules that aren't implied by the mathematics. This view has been dubbed the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics and has been championed by some of the brightest minds working on the philosophy of fundamental physics like Sean Carroll and David Wallace. The many worlds interpretation is a hard pill to swallow for some people, especially if you're particularly captured by naive physicality in which extension and solidity are fundamental properties of the world. The natural question to ask is, where are all these worlds? How do we have space for them? However, cutting-edge physics championed by leaders in the field like Nima Arkani Hamed have declared, after reviewing various lines of evidence, that space-time is dead, that there must be something more fundamental than even Einstein's idea of space-time as a combined manifold, eliminating the concerns we often have about the location of alternate worlds or what happened at the beginning of time. Many worlds does not state that there are spatially separate Earths, for example, but just that all life possibilities are active at the same time and generally in the same space. The hardest thing for people to swallow, though, is that according to many worlds, every single possible subatomic difference bifurcates the universe into a separate timeline, resulting in a rapidly branching structure. This is particularly a concern if you believe that for any given macroscopic state, that all of the microscopic states have to be fixed, that any quantum difference branches timelines even on the macroscopic scale. That is, every time one of your atoms changes state, you branch into 2 timelines, each with a U. To some people, this seems ontologically extravagant. But what if our macroscopic world literally exists atop, usually, more than one microscopic state? Unlike the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics that assumes a macroscopic timeline split for every quantum possibility, what if one macroscopic world is somewhat robust in the face of subatomic possibilities? It turns out that there is a concept related to emergence that already gives us a framework for this called supervenience. Supervenience is just this relation. For P, a macroscale system, to supervene on Q, a microscale system, there must be some Q change anytime P changes. That is, there must be a microscale change every time there is a macroscale change. To take one example, imagine the macroscale system P is my arm, and the microscale system Q is all the atoms in my arm and their relations. If I move my arm here, the spatial location of the atoms in my arm must move. It's impossible, in other words, for my arm to be here and the atoms that compose my arm to be somewhere else. The reverse isn't the case, though. It may be the case that an atom from my arm moves, say it swaps places with an atom beside it, and my arm doesn't move. In fact, there are a large number of atomic states that are compatible with my arm being in a steady state. So we get a relation where if I change my arm position, the atom positions must change, but if the atom positions change, it doesn't necessarily mean that my arm position is changing. This opens up the possibility that my arm supervenes on the whole set of those possible atomic differences, rather than just one possibility in the set. Put in terms of possible worlds at the microscopic level, we could say that the macroscopic possible world supervenes on some set of microscopic possible worlds. That is, things like minds and persons, and much else, exist across microscopic possible worlds. I need to emphasize this point because of how important it is for what follows. It's not that, given a macroscale state, we look at the set of compatible microstates and understand that only one of the states in the set of compatible microstates is really there. Rather, it's that when we look at the set of compatible microstates, we understand that they are all simultaneously really there. The idea that a macroscopic world exists atop more than one microscopic world I call the slightly fewer worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. Because while there are every bit as many quantum worlds as suggested by the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, given that our macroscopic worlds exist atop some set of those quantum possible worlds, there are fewer macroscopic worlds than quantum worlds. And given that these macroscopic worlds are the ones typically we care about, I think it justifies the slightly fewer label. While the idea of multiple real timelines may sound like something from science fiction, I think it comports beautifully with some of the things the ancients said about reality. First, I don't see any other way of reconciling the idea that our vertical ontology moves from pure pattern to pure possibility without possibilities in the intermediate space being real in that space. However, there are also some arcane things said by Plotinus, for example, that seem to indicate that the mind of God is filled with all possible thoughts. The Platonic forms themselves appear, to me, to be explained by the structure of reality and the possibilities that remain within it after the distinctions have been made by pure pattern. The idea also sets up a kind of triangular hierarchy within our vertical ontology, where there are an indefinite number of worlds at the bottom, and only one world at the top, the true, the beautiful, and the good, the world of God. That top world, in our layered reality, subsumes some set of possible worlds down the hierarchy, and those worlds subsume more at the next step down, etc. We don't have access to these other worlds after they have been differentiated from ours, so they are invisible to us until we hit the quantum world, where this nesting of possible worlds becomes unavoidably apparent. Consider the explanatory tools this perspective gives us. We have in the single topmost world that subsumes all possibilities down the hierarchy, a telos, an eschatological end state. This helps to explain away the fine-tuning problem and various miracles by saying that the reason these possible but unlikely things happen is that they are necessary in a universe pointed toward that single master pattern at the top. We look at these things and marvel at their unlikelihood, but only worlds in which these unlikelihoods happen are worlds that end up subsumed by the eschatological end state, the pure pattern at the top of our vertical ontology. It also provides room for free will without falling to the fatalism that might come with the idea of God's plan. It turns out that God's plan works over possible worlds, not over this one timeline exclusively. So our decisions are real, and so is the will that freely makes them, with obvious constraints. It also gives some meat to the idea of grace and eternal salvation. It may be that some of our possible timelines are dead ends. That is, the timeline is truncated chronologically, which might happen in a timeline with all-out nuclear war, for example. It is grace alone that finds us in one of the timelines that are not prematurely truncated. I think in addition to providing solutions to pre-existing philosophical problems, this idea of many worlds also gives us an insight into what consciousness might be. Perhaps it is consciousness itself that cleaves apart the possibility space through dynamic entanglement, and a way of understanding living patterns that will help to answer the question about whether higher beings are in fact real, and if so, which of them are conscious. But these ideas must wait until part 2.